Hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar from Glassdoor and Greenhouse, the numbers game, how to use data to land top talent. We have a really great webinar for you today. I'm Katie Williams, and I'm marketing manager at Glassdoor, and I'm going to be moderating today's event. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. All right, so all lines are muted, so if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the question and answer pane at the right-hand corner of your screen, and we'll be sure to answer those at the end of the session. We will also be sending out this slide deck after the presentation as well as the recording, so be sure to look in your email for that from us. And without further ado, I want to introduce our awesome speakers. We have Kirsten Davidson. She's the head of employer brand at Glassdoor. She's responsible for sustaining and growing Glassdoor's vibrant employer brand while navigating the challenges that come with hypergrowth. Her work includes leveraging Glassdoor's powerful data to provide insights and learnings that help global employers navigate a new world where the lines between recruiting, marketing, brand, and culture are increasingly blurred. Prior to Glassdoor, Kirsten helped build and lead the global employment brand for industry leaders, including Visa and eBay. Next, we have Lauren Ryan. She's the Director of Talent Acquisition at Greenhouse, which is a recruiting optimization platform used by companies like Airbnb, Pinterest, and Siscion. In her role as Director of Talent Acquisition, Lauren leads recruiting strategy, tracks the company's recruiting KPIs, and oversees process improvements. She's a self-described data geek and loves discussing recruiting metrics. Before Greenhouse, Lauren was at the operations team at Google. So welcome to both of our speakers. Again, you'll get the recording and the slide deck after the session, and if you have any questions, please feel free to type it in the question and answer pane, and we'll get to those at the end. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kirsten Davidson. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi. Let's see, so we already did an introduction here, so let's go to the next slide. I'm really looking forward today to talking about not just talent analytics and kind of insights you can gather from there, but to have Greenhouse really share the KPIs that they're using, and then very transparently they're going to be showing what they're measuring today as well. So the reason we're here today is because the average employer is spending $4,000 to hire each person they're looking at, and it's taking an average of 52 days to hire, which means companies are having to get smart about where they can close that gap, how they can do it for less in order to win as a team. Now, the discipline for talent analytics is a mandate today for HR and business leaders around the world. And the reason is it's not just an HR function anymore. HR increasingly is a big part of driving the success of the organization. It's no longer kind of within the walls of HR. Success of our people, hiring, being able to win at talent is essential for competitive advantage. And so HR is being asked to be part of and provide metrics that circle back into marketing, that circle back into the overall organizational goals. And so being able to manage and track the right metrics that support the overall business goals is really key. So I'm going to talk about talent analytics, 5 ways you can apply talent analytics kind of at a higher level to really be able to start to set benchmarks, evaluate how you're doing today, and really understand the gaps that your organization has that you need to fill in, and then how to maybe put more effort into the stuff that's working. And then Lauren's going to share key KPIs for organizations, not that she's only seen in her experience, but that they're also tracking at Greenhouse to really win and make a big difference for them. And then some tips for practical application. Our hope today is not just that you hear some good stuff, but that you walk away with things that you can implement to make a difference. So 5 ways to win with talent analytics. So the first is using talent analytics to make sure you're forecasting correctly and setting budgets. So how to use talent analytics? So as you measure what you have today, it allows you to really anticipate your hiring needs, so you can understand where in the organization is it taking longer time to fill. Where in the organization are you having a harder time? Where are you being really successful? Being able to break those goals down by even job title, job department, getting really granular so that you can have a very clear picture of your organization today. It allows you to really determine what is and isn't working. And, as you look going forward and you need to make investments, you have to require budget, you have to ask for budget. Being able to back that up with data is key. And then lastly, where are you getting your hires from? A lot of us invest in multiple sources, including Glassdoor, but you have LinkedIn, you have your recruiters, you have your outsourced recruiters. There's a handful at any time. Where are you getting the best results? How do you tune that up, and where do you need to invest going forward? Again, having the data against this is key in order to set the budget that you need. Secondly, using talent analytics to make sure you're developing supporting programs. So this is really about, the ancillary pieces of your sourcing. So employee referral programs for a lot of companies is one of the most valuable places for quality of hire, also for time to hire. Where are you winning here? Your employee referrals, where are they mostly coming into? Is it marketing? Is it engineering? How do you align that to really support the needs that you have? For mobile recruiting, taking a look at how you can be more successful there. How many people are coming into mobile recruiting today? How many people are you losing because you don't have a solid mobile recruiting strategy in place? Also employer branding. So as you look to bring more people in, if it's taking a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of times it can help you secure the budget you need to do more employer branding. And then really importantly are your diversity initiatives. So where are you struggling as an organization from a diversity perspective? How do you set goals against that and the budget that you need? Having, again, insights to what's working. This allows you to help fill in some of those gaps. The third way to use talent analytics is really understanding the candidate perspective. I think this is a really key one, that we all move so fast it's hard to slow down and really think like a candidate. We have our systems in place, that's kind of how we go, and we assume it's all working. But I really encourage you to have yourself or someone on your team even go through the application process. It probably has been a little while for some of us. So applying online with your phone. What sources are you going through to apply? If you pretend you're totally on the outside, where are you going to get your information? How do you go through the funnel? What is the experience like all the way through? And using that as great fodder for what you need to improve. Channels are an important piece. So marketers are checking out different sources of information than engineers are. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Having talent analytics really helps you understand what's resonating with different groups, helps you measure where your effectiveness is there and where you need to put additional resources based on where the needs of the business are. And then make sure you're getting feedback, and not just getting it, but really analyzing it. I talked to a client a little while ago that was saying they had reached out to an outside organization who had managed all their exit interviews, for example, and the organization that handles it said, you're the first person to call me from this organization in 2 years. So the company was doing a great job collecting the information, but also making sure you're analyzing that for results. So on your application process, the difference between doing it on mobile desktop, it can be as simple as a pop-up survey to just ask if people are willing to give feedback. That's oftentimes with an ATS pretty easy to do. And then also on the interview process, Glassdoor is a really great place to get that. It's free. You don't even have to be a customer. And building that into your processes. So at the maybe close of the interview process, reaching back out. What worked, what didn't. Having someone on the team be responsible for looking at that. For example, one of the things we learned at Glassdoor when we were analyzing our own data on the interview process, what we saw was we got the highest number of negative reviews from people who got no response. So we got pretty good reviews from people who accepted, obviously, and we got really good reviews also from people who had declined an offer, but it was the people who just didn't hear back. So it was as simple as creating a checklist that all recruiters now go through, and as they're evaluating every resume that comes through, we now have emails that we send out just to say, hey, we got it. We don't have anything at this time that meets your qualifications, but we'd love to stay in touch. And it's made a dramatic improvement for us. We even recently saw an interview review that said, you know, I've sent out so many resumes, I haven't heard back at all. It's been really frustrating. Glassdoor is actually the only people I even heard back from. So, small example of where you can make really small tweaks based on the analytics that you get and pay attention to. Fourth way you can use talent analytics is to be refining your message along the way. So it's easy to kind of set it and forget it. There's so much work that goes into your messaging and to the branding around it, but soliciting feedback from, let's say, engineers versus marketers versus finance, what really resonated for them, what most attracted them to the company, and dialing that up. Monitoring the competition, the field's changing rapidly with acquisitions, mergers even, and where does that put you in knowing how to put your best foot forward? Don't be afraid to evolve your messaging. That can also be the messaging even in the job descriptions that you put out, having some thoughtful processes around making sure it's not just a one-size-fits-all. And knowing where you win from an employer message standpoint and where your weaknesses are doesn't mean you have to be all things to everybody. You want to be the right thing to the right person. So having insights about what resonates for people makes a big, big difference. And lastly, it's really important as you have these benchmark pieces that you can start to develop what your reporting timeline is. I think a lot of times in HR or in talent acquisition, even employer branding, we tend to have these metrics, we're keeping them to ourselves. But the more that we can integrate with the larger organization and business leaders to say, here's how often we're going to be reporting back to you, here's what we're measuring, making sure that aligns with the business goals of the organization, they know what to expect, they're able then to build some of those metrics and track into their own programs and success creates a lot of synergy across functions, and it's not uncommon where it's a bit of a struggle across different functions, so helping to align. And then how do you get started here? I'm really excited for Lauren to walk through this part. We were talking about this earlier. She has some really interesting pieces here. So again, aligning your goals from HR to the business objectives and needs, making sure that it's not just about getting people in the seats and kind of checking off our own goals, but that there's a really strategic overall need for HR to be able to report out on how meeting those goals is helping to make the organization successful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to share what they've learned about their key performance indicators, what they're tracking today, and how they're putting that into use.
Thanks, Kirsten. Hey, everyone. I'm Lauren. Thanks for the introduction earlier, Katie. I'm the Director of Talent Acquisition at Greenhouse, and coming from a background mostly in ops and consulting, and now doing that same kind of process work, but from a recruiting perspective. So what I wanted to walk through today was two different things. One is kind of a high-level description of the KPIs that we've found really impactful, both looking at our overall customer base, but also at Greenhouse on our recruiting team. And then we'll also dive into a bit of a case study on how our analytics have impacted the way we work as a Greenhouse recruiting team. So first, on KPIs, before we dive into what I'm actually measuring, I'd like to take a step back at what a key performance indicator is. So we've heard this word before. We understand what it means at a high level. I think as much as understanding what a KPI is, it's understanding what a KPI is not. So what makes a KPI is one that you've really boiled down your list of metrics into what's most critical. And that would apply to all the different categories that Kirsten just walked through. If you're going to be thinking about your employer brand, what are the most critical metrics that you'd want to measure for employer brand rather than the laundry list of things that you could potentially measure. And I think another really key piece of this is the indicator thing. Like, you want to find metrics that are signals and give you an opportunity to track things at a high level over time, and then just dive in more deeply when you see that things are moving or getting off track, but that really give you a great boiled up picture of the outcomes. So Kirsten walked through a lot of different ways that talent teams will want to think about data. One particular piece of that is the recruiting process. So these KPIs are the things that we see make a big impact when you're trying to optimize your recruiting process. And the way we thought about this, and when we were chatting with our customers to understand what they were measuring, what they wanted to be measuring, and what was impactful for recruiting teams, we thought about, as many of us do, the recruiting process as a funnel, much like a sales funnel, where you start with a very broad top of funnel, a lot of candidates that may or may not be qualified to move through your process or even be applying to the relevant job. Your job is to kind of start to vet and weed those people out. And then interviewing is about moving great people through your process and making sure you're both understanding who they are and how they can contribute to your organization, making sure they're understanding the same thing about you. And then finally, the hiring piece, where you have just a few people at the end, and you want to make sure you're bringing them in because you've identified a great candidate. So thinking about that funnel then, we came up with a laundry list of all the things that we could measure to understand what's going on in each of those three pieces, and came up with 5 KPIs across those 3 pieces of the funnel that really act as a wonderful signal and indicator for how your process is going and allows you to optimize along the way. So I'm going to walk through all 5 of these. The first is a sourcing metric. We call it number of QCs, and QCs are qualified candidates. The way we've defined qualified candidates, and this might be different at every organization, but it's a way to measure who is at least superficially qualified for the job that you're screening for. They've passed app review, let's call it, and you're ready to move them through the process. And the reason this is a great metric is because it acts as a leading indicator for how your search is going. As you start to track this over time, you get a sense for how many QCs you need on any given search to make a hire. So if you're 3 weeks into a search and you have had only 1/3 of the QCs you're used to seeing, you have time to pivot early and double down on that search and get it back on track. So that's the sourcing piece. And then as we start to move through the rest of the process, the interviewing piece is where we spend most of our time. And that's everything from when you've decided someone's a qualified candidate then all the way through interviewing them and deciding to make an offer or reject them out of your process. I see 2 sides of the coin here. We both want to think about efficiency and then also quality of this process. The efficiency piece, the timing piece, we call source to close or source to offer. It's the amount of days between when the person that ultimately gets an offer applies to your process and then makes it to the offer stage. So that tells you how many days someone sees themselves as being in your process before they have final word on whether or not they'll be hired. That tells you efficiency. And then the other side of that coin then is understanding how people perceive the quality of your experience. And we use candidate survey results for this. And we also use Glassdoor reviews to help us anecdotally add color to our candidate survey results. So what we track is quarter over quarter whether or not people say they had a positive candidate experience. Once you understand the interviewing piece of your process, then you can move on to hiring. Hiring tends to have much fewer data points, right? You've gotten down to maybe 1 or 2 final candidates for each role, but you want to make sure that once you've identified the candidate that your team really likes and wants to bring on board, that you're able to actually bring them on board. So what we track for that is offer acceptance rate. And then this last one might seem self-evident, but what's interesting about it is that you have to have solid goals to be able to report on how close to goal you were month over month. And I know that with a lot of recruiting teams, ours has certainly operated this way in the past. Goals feel like they change mid-month a lot when all of a sudden hiring needs change, or you didn't know that the sales team is going to need a hire, but then you find that out. So as much of this is about your process is also about being able to understand what's needed of your team so that you can report on that. So then if we look at those 5 KPIs then and visually map it back to the funnel again, starting at the top, we're thinking about the number of qualified candidates and making sure that we have enough people in the pipeline to be able to reasonably predict a hire coming up for any given role or for the team as a whole. Then as we move on to the interviewing process, that real kind of process piece of our overall team's work, we're looking at source to close, how many days are in that piece of the pie, and then finally candidate survey results. And then when we're down to the very end of the funnel, what we want to be tracking is offer acceptance rate. This feels a lot of these feel a lot like sales metrics, but that offer acceptance rate is kind of like your close ratio, right? And then finally hires to goal to make sure that you are doing what you've committed to the business. So those are the KPIs that we've seen customers track to be successful and that we've used a ton internally at Greenhouse also. Just some kind of anecdotal notes on how we've used them. This can feel overwhelming, 5 KPIs that you need to be tracking quarter over quarter. You're not sure exactly where to dive in. What we've done from a reporting, speaking to Kirsten's point about making sure that you know your kind of reporting cadence and have established a way to get these out to the right stakeholders, we create a report on these 5 quarter over quarter. And then usually just pick one to dive into for the following quarter. We'll pick the one that feels like it could use the most work or has the most opportunity for improvement and commit to that as our area of focus for the next quarter, rather than try and spread ourselves too thin across all 5, which has been a really nice way to see measurable improvement over time on all of them. So thinking then about those are the KPIs that we see kind of working from a recruiting process perspective. I want to zoom in one level then and talk about how we've used analytics like this to impact the way that the Greenhouse recruiting team does our work. And the area of focus will be on workforce planning. So looking at January 2016, I was looking backwards at what 2016 had felt like. And it had been a year, I think many of our recruiting teams experienced this, where goals changed often. We were in hyper-growth mode. We had some sort of plan, but it was very high level. And it was really hard for us to predict what the quarter was going to look like, or at the end of the quarter to say whether or not it had been a good one, because the backlog got longer and we weren't able to really say that we were as efficient as we wanted to be. So we had our 5 KPIs. We've been tracking them over time. What was nice about that is that we could say that we were consistently hitting our KPI goals. So we knew that, at least from a process perspective, we were running really efficiently. So there was something else to work on together as an organization to make sure the recruiting team was set up to hit its goals. And something I realized by looking at a board deck that we had put together was that sales has a really consistent and common way to communicate their goals and attainment to the business. This chart it exists in every organization and every kind of sales team. And all it is the revenue goals that the sales team had committed to month over month in those blue line graphs. And then their level of attainment month over month in that blue line chart going up and to the right. So this, I think, was something that the recruiting team could do too. We had kind of established earlier that the recruiting funnel is not dissimilar to the sales funnel. Once you have your analytics in place and have been tracking all of your metrics, you have a way to start to predict each of your pipelines. So the piece that was missing was being able to promise to what we would do month over month. So I wanted to nail down hiring goals so that we can end up with a chart like this at the end of the year, where I could look backwards and speak to senior leadership and say, month over month, we promised this many hires every month. Here's how we did. Of course, I wanted that dark blue line to be much higher than the light blue bar graphs, but either way, having a chart like this felt like it could be a win. But what I needed to be able to do this was to understand what the hiring needs were for the organization and how realistic it was for our team to hit them. So I embarked on a journey of driving headcount plan and understanding how our recruiting team could commit to that headcount plan. There were 6 steps here. I'll walk through all of them and then we'll dive into just a few of them in more detail. The way I did this at Greenhouse was, first, we needed the headcount plan, right? We needed something a little bit tighter and more detailed than we had had the year before. The way to do that was to start with the organizational goals and then understand the headcount requirements to get to those goals. The reason I wanted to start with goals is because it would allow me to predict how the plan would change. If I knew why sales needed the headcount team, like the team of 30 that they needed, and how that fed into revenue goals, then I could also be ahead of the game when in July revenue goals changed and be able to help my team understand how that was going to change our hiring plan as well. So the first step was understanding goals and headcount requirements for each of the departments. The second piece then was understanding how that list by department matched up with organizational priorities. And the reason this part of the exercise was important is because we had found ourselves in a position of trying to understand or make a decision on whether or not we should hire the marketing headcount that was being asked of us versus a sales or an engineering headcount that was being asked of us. Recruiting wasn't in the right position to understand at the org-wide level which of those roles were most strategically important if we only had the capacity to hire one. So the second step then was sitting down, in our case with the CEO, but someone that would have a holistic picture of your organization, to prioritize each role across the year and across departments as well. The third step, and we'll dive into this in more detail, is to quantify the recruiting team's capacity to support those goals. And then assuming, and in most cases, there will be a delta between what the recruiting team's capacity is and what the org wants to hire for the year, you need to calibrate that. And then the last steps are really just communication pieces to make sure that your counterparts throughout the organization understand how you're thinking about capacity, how they can expect partnership from the recruiting team throughout the year, and setting you up to be able to pivot as things, undeniably change throughout the year. So if what I was trying to get was that sales chart, right, where I know what I'm committing to month over month and think that it's a kind of like a reasonable promise to make, the two things I needed were to model out which roles my team can fill and when they can fill them by. So thinking about which roles my team can fill, I developed a recruiting capacity model that I'm going to walk through at a high level, and we can chat through more detail if you have any questions. So I think something all of us know that run a recruiting team is that all roles are not created equally. It's very different for my VP of engineering to come and say I need a tech lead than it is for the VP of sales to come and ask for a sales development representative. Those are two very different hiring processes, and it takes very different resources from my recruiting team. So we didn't want to treat it as all roles are created equal, which is why saying like each recruiter can fill 5 roles per month didn't make sense for us. So we built a points model, and we weighted roles by difficulty. And difficulty will depend on your organization, but for us, things that varied the number of points that each role carried were things like what the market bared. So there are fewer engineers in the world than there are people that would be great at sales, and so that dictated level of points. But also things like internal alignment. We saw that roles that were new to the organization required a lot more meetings between the recruiting team and the hiring manager, and were taking us longer to kind of get alignment in the first place. And so that was also built into the model in terms of points as well. So first, figure out what points schematic makes sense for your organization, and align on that with you and your recruiters and some of your leadership as well. The next step then was to figure out how many points a recruiter can reasonably carry in any given month. So the way I did this was after we'd aligned on how many points each, what points meant more or less and what kind of roles fell into each point bucket, I went backwards over the last year and a half and assigned all the roles that we had closed points in that same schema. So we then knew over the last year and a half that each recruiter had been carrying on average X number of points and could use that to then extrapolate forward. So once we had the average, we calculated out the team for the whole year. And again, this is going to be organization specific. This is a basic framework. For example, you might want to say that senior recruiters can on average carry more points than your more junior recruiters. Or maybe your sourcers help do some of the phone screens for your roles. And so those, there's some like half points that you can allocate in that way. So think about what makes sense, but this is the basic framework to be able to say my recruiting team can hit X number of points for a year. And then it's possible that this exercise leaves you just right on the nose of points necessary and points that your team can do, which would be awesome. Probably not, and so then you have some calibration to do. collaborate with your senior leadership to figure out what's best for the business. There's a ton of different options. For us, what it meant was a little bit of growing the recruiting team and a little bit of using more agencies than we decided. You know, if you're way off on number of points and number of and what the recruiting team can do, you probably need to grow the recruiting team, but you're going to have this model that tells you exactly how many recruiters you need because you know exactly what your delta is. If you're only off in a couple of months, for example, or it's not enough points to carry a whole person, then you can use agencies or recruiters. There's a lot of, and I think the third one is actually interesting too. It's possible that at the end of your alignment process, you realize you are under capacity, but you're only under capacity on the roles that were kind of the nice to haves, not the need to haves. And so your business leadership might decide that it makes sense to actually cut from the headcount plan those like nice to have roles rather than hire the extra recruiter, depending on what your org looks like. So model out a lot of different scenarios, walk through them with senior leadership, and figure out how to close that gap together. So now we have the team we need, right? We have a hiring plan, we have it prioritized, we have month over month who needs to be in a seat. We have the team we need to hit those goals. The last piece of this then is using some of the KPIs that we've talked about to create the plan that will get you there. So you can use, you know, your average days to offer, source to close days, and the average time to source and time to fill to accurately commit to hires every month so that you end up with commitments on a quarterly basis that make sense, and then a chart like this at the end of the year that helps you demonstrate to your senior leadership how effective your team was. And what was really cool about this process as we went through it, just in terms of, you know, the recruiting team acting as partners to the department leadership, it served as a really nice communication tool. So I was able to take it to, for example, my VP of marketing, and in the end have a conversation that looked something like, you know, okay, Barb, your team's headcount ask for the year is about 12% of the points of the overall organization's headcount plan. What that means to me and how I'm thinking about it is that means you should always have, on average, about 12% of the recruiting team's capacity. Does that sound fair to you? Does that sound like a reasonable way to think about the team's capacity? And it served as a really great communication tool to maybe reprioritize sometimes, to think about different roles in different lights than I had been so far, and make sure we were on totally the same page when we left the meeting about how the recruiting team's resources would be allocated month over month.
Thank you, Lauren. You have some really interesting insights on that, how you applied that. So before we leave, I just wanted to say, once again, kind of review the power of talent analytics, how that allows you to provide insights that help you forecast and just set the right benchmarks so you can be successful at the end of the year. Understand how to address gaps and refine your processes and make sure you have the budget that you need to do that. And then when it comes to KPIs, learning from some of the people who do it best, and as you track your recruiting efforts, paying attention to 5 key things: the number of qualified candidates, not just number of candidates, days to offer, because the people who can close it fastest are the ones who win. Make sure you're evaluating your survey results, not just so that you can and you have your numbers, but so that you're really able to extract how you can improve along the way. Tracking your offer acceptance rate, I think, is a really important measurement of how effective the process is all the way through. When people accept, you know that from coming in, they had the right expectations, and by the time they got through it and when they accepted, they knew what to expect along the way, and you're not losing them in the process. And then hires to goals. So you have accurate goals. You're reflecting what's the need of the business. Talent analytics is key for eliminating the guesswork in recruiting, which often happens. The ability to provide value and effectiveness to the overall organization is key, because when you're aligned with the business and all systems are working together, from marketing to business organizations, the leadership team, HR, everyone wins. So with that, I want to close. I want to thank everyone for joining and also open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you, Lauren and Kirsten. That was awesome. So we do have a few questions on the line, but please feel free to type in more, and we'll get to those. Also, we'll be sending out the deck for those of you who didn't join us in the beginning, and we'll also be sending the recording out so you guys can rewatch this and use it to your advantage. Okay, so first question from Amanda is, what does right look like on those metrics?
So I think the question here probably is, when you're looking, are there industry benchmarks against it? So how do you know if what you're tracking and how you're doing as an organization is good?
That's a great question. So it's a two-part answer. I think for some KPIs, there will be benchmarks. For example, with days to close, or that timing metric, we are able to kind of take anonymized averages across our customers and share what on average we're seeing. I think that average is something like 45 days across customers, and so we share that with our customers when we can. And then not everything will be benchmarkable, right? For example, with qualified candidates, that's going to be pretty unique to your organization and the type of role that you're thinking about. If you're hiring for a role, for example, where it's hard to tell from someone's resume if they're qualified, a sales development representative, someone that's right out of school, it's much more about how they conduct themselves, how they are able to think on their feet. So you need to do probably more calls and screen more people, and therefore have more qualified candidates for each of those pipelines than you would for someone that is an accountant, and what you're looking for is if they have a CPA and Big Four experience, these things that you can vet much more from a resume. So the way we've developed our own goals is to kind of use that same bucketing system where we put things into buckets by difficulty, and then I work with my recruiters to kind of say, like, which role felt perfect to you? Which role felt efficient? It felt like you were using your time well. We got to a hire really quickly. Let's use that as our own benchmark for now and think about how we can drive the rest of the pipelines to that number. And then when we get there, we can figure out what the next goal is as well. So I don't think all of these is about comparing yourself to other companies. Sometimes that's a really helpful way to do it. And then sometimes it's about just setting a reasonable but aggressive goals internally based on, you know, what you're seeing within your organization and what seems possible for you.
Great. All right, next question. When hiring is on hold or when it is unpredictable, how do you determine how much time and how many resources you should dedicate to pipeline recruiting and building up candidates for the future? How far in advance is too far to start recruiting? This can be difficult as a recruiter and for candidates when the timeline is unknown.
All right, this is Kirsten. This is actually a really interesting one because we're seeing right now a slight slowdown. I think clients or customers and employers are starting to, you know, in certain roles, maybe hire a little less aggressively. I actually think it's a really smart time to kind of double down on this stuff. You have a little bit more time on your teams to really get smart about this, to be working closely with the business organizations. I actually think while recruiting is sometimes cyclical, the employer branding, by building a impressive pipeline that you can pull from at any time and really focusing on your employees never goes out. In fact, when things slow down just a little bit, like the housing market, that's when you buy. This is the time to really get it right. In terms of how far in advance is too far, I think it's really key to be aligned with the businesses, really understand what their timelines are, and to not move out too far ahead of that. Because when you do engage a really good candidate, it's hard to keep them warm for a long time. It can often translate into a bad experience when you don't have a clear, defined path for them, and you don't want to lose somebody like that. So even if the timeline changes partway through, I think being really transparent is important, but again, I wouldn't get too far out when it comes to specific roles. I'm trying to think if there's anything else in here we haven't taken care of. I think we got everything there.
Okay.
A lot of questions about
Next
KPIs.
question. What metrics were used to decide how many points to assign to a role? For example, salary, grade, new replacement, headcount, etc.
Great question. So what we used was mostly an understanding of availability in the market from a candidate perspective, and like a candidate skills perspective. We used qualified candidates as a way to understand kind of like as a proxy for the availability of candidates in the market. For example, with some of our engineering roles, we find that we have to do far more screens, qualified candidate conversations, than we do for our marketing roles, because the engineers have so many options that they're just having those calls and vetting out many, many jobs. So I use qualified candidates as a way to kind of divide lines in the sand of easy and medium and difficult. And then for us, what was a really big one was whether or not it was a brand new role to the organization, because brand new roles for us, we do lengthy kickoff processes. We build very unique custom kits for every interview process we're going through. So that's a ton of work for the recruiting team. And it's one of the biggest differences in our general pipeline. So I think that's what we did, but I would really encourage you to think about what differentiates roles in your organization, where your bottlenecks are from a time perspective, and use that to decide how you want to allocate points.
Great. Okay. Next question. Are all of these KPIs and data analytics available with the standard Greenhouse subscription, or is the analytics license required? Can you perhaps give some examples of what's available on the standard platform versus with the license?
Yeah, so you should be able to calculate all of these with the standard Greenhouse reporting. Some of them you'll probably download the report and export to Excel and do a little bit of calculating, but you have all the data you need in the typical Greenhouse report. I do use the analytics license, and the reason that is makes life a little bit easier is because it does a lot of the aggregating for me so that I don't worry about making a mistake on the Excel formulas, for example, and it does visualizations.
Great. Okay, next question. I was wondering what the most important metrics to focus on are when you have limited resources, budget, and or leadership support.
Well, from a recruiting KPI perspective, I don't think the tracking of those 5 takes very long. It takes you a little bit to set them up, but it's going to take you a little while to set up any particular KPI that you're going to decide to track over time. So I think all 5 are great because they provide you a holistic picture of your entire pipeline. And then you just have to kind of tap into them on a quarterly basis to see how things are going. I think the more important piece when you're talking about limited resources or limited time is deciding what to do about them. And particularly because you're talking about leadership support, I think that what I've found effective is to focus on one, to pick the thing that you think will be most impactful in moving the needle in any given quarter and make that your focus. We did, in Q4, the Greenhouse recruiting team was focused pretty much on just moving the needle on candidate experience. And then in Q1, we were focused on moving the needle on our days to close timing KPI, which made it very approachable for the recruiting team to focus efforts, and we were able to see a meaningful movement without trying to kind of overstretch ourselves. So I'd recommend trying that and can focus your best efforts on the most impactful thing.
Great. Okay, it looks like we have time for a few more questions. Do you have a suggestion on where we could locate the best/current KPI reporting examples?
So I can jump. It's not the reporting examples, but Burson, part of Deloitte, Josh Burson, has some really great industry standards about reporting that he comes out with every year, just on benchmarks against these things. So you can at least measure sort of where you stand within the market a little bit. That can be a really good resource. There certainly are other reports that come out, but that's a fairly standard one. Then in terms of KPI reporting examples, so Lauren was able to share one. Do you know of others that you guys have from clients?
On locating the best KPI reporting examples. You know, I'm not sure. I know we have an ebook on our KPIs, and I would be happy to share the deck that I use to share with senior leadership every quarter and how I communicate those to folks and end up representing them. Other than that, I don't know that I've seen an actual example of the report as much as I see kind of blogs that share what we shared today on what the metrics are and why you would want to measure them.
Great. Okay, so next question. What process did you use to influence the business to buy into workforce planning? Businesses tend to move when things become too painful. I want to get ahead of the pain. What are some effective ways you've used to get them on board?
So I described it as pretty painful. I made an argument for why what we had done in 2015, while it was great and we had hired a ton and moved, Greenhouse quite a bit, why it wasn't all that we can do as a recruiting team, and helped highlight some of the things that were frustrating, which translated into our business partners being frustrated as well. So kind of like what I mentioned, where we didn't necessarily know what the right trade-off was between a sales, a marketing, or an engineering hire. We would usually go with whoever was loudest, right? Whoever was asking us most and near our desk most. And so highlighting that for the CEO of we're making these trade-off decisions. They're probably not the right ones for the business. Would you like to get involved in this and see if there's some other way to systematically understand what our priorities are? That was one example. And I'll state transparently that I'm really fortunate to work at a company that is very people-centric and understands this stuff. But something else that was important is that I was painting a picture of how it was tough for my recruiting team to feel successful when at the end of every month we would look at a pile of hires that we'd made. We were hiring a bunch of people, but our backlog was long, and the team had this collective sense of not knowing if what we were doing was good enough because there was always something we weren't doing. And that to me felt like my job as a manager to try and fix. And so I partnered with leadership to try and help them understand how their teams would feel in a similar situation and see if collectively we could figure out a solution for not having that be the case going forward. So it was a lot of communication. I glossed over it in that in the slides we went through, but all the meetings on aligning and figuring out what the headcount plan is and what percentage of capacity each team had, some of those meetings happened many times. It was a matter of just really trying to get on the same page of understanding, which I know is difficult in some organizations, but it was, I was tenacious and just kept having the conversation.
Yeah, I would second that. And I would say, take a page. I see a lot of this is really related to what marketing processes have been all along. So really understanding in your organization, it's not as simple. I think it's much more qualitative than doing a survey out to people about what the pain points are with recruiting or how we can improve or how we can better support the needs, but really sitting down with some of the business leaders, maybe some of the key hiring managers, to understand how do we make this process more efficient? I want to get ahead of it. I want to make sure that we're building a great functionality as a team now so that we can have the infrastructure in place. And having people understand that's the perspective you're coming from, I think could be really helpful. And I think it's actually a really smart idea to get out ahead of this, create the infrastructure so that when things do speed up, guys have a good process, there's good communication and plan, they know how you'll support, they know how to prioritize along with you. I think that goes a really long way.
I also think any senior leader would want to be able to kind of look at that line graph that we looked at together. They want that at the end of the year. That's something that they're used to seeing from other departments. It's something that helps them understand how their teams are doing, and it helps them kind of promote how well the business went. And so if what you are able to do is say, I want to get to this for you, I want you to have this graph at the end of the year, here's where my gaps are and here's what I need to be able to do that, it becomes a very different conversation than just trying to paint micro examples of kind of the pain that I had highlighted before.
Great. All right, we have time for one more question, and then we'll probably be able to compile all of these questions in a blog post. We did get a whole bunch, and so we'll be able to answer those and put them up on the web. So next question is, what sort of information should be shared with my recruiters monthly to keep them engaged?
Well, the question of engagement is interesting. What I share with my recruiters to kind of help highlight the amount of ownership they have over a role's ability to be successful and help them be strategic partners to their business, to their hiring managers, is we actually kind of use many pieces of the KPI to predict pipelines for each individual roles and then make promises to hiring managers against those. So what we try and do is say, we need this many screens for any given role. For this particular role to be on track, we need them by this date. We expect this many on-sites by such and such date, which should get us a hire by June 30th or whatever it is. And so then they become the owner of the success of those things, right? Not just the hire, but all of these milestones along the way that they're able to set themselves up for success for, and then kind of check off the list and share with their hiring manager that we're hitting milestones along the way, rather than just like hoping or like collectively moving towards a hire at the end of the pipeline. And we visit those pipelines together weekly and figure out like what we want to be communicating to hiring managers almost on a weekly basis and how we can troubleshoot so that we don't end up in a tough spot at the end of a particular role. And then I also just make sure that they understand what our KPIs, what commitments we're making to senior leadership, and why their work on a daily basis is helping us as a team make those commitments.
Great. All right, I think that's the end. Thank you so much, Lauren and Kirsten. This was a great webinar, lots of awesome information. We'll be putting out a blog post to answer most of your other questions, as well as sending you out the recording and the deck. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat before we close out, and we'll make sure to get those answered. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.